I'd wait for the young guy. He's the only one that knows how to do it. But you have to take a number when you go in.
But you can say, I'd like to wait for.
Oh yeah, that's very normal to wait for somebody.
Mm-hmm.
They don't care. Nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, Amen. Veni Sancte Spiritus, repletuorum cora fidelium, et tui amoris ignei signum accende, emite Spiritum tuum creabuntur,
et renovavis faciente.
Oremus Deus e cora fidelium, Sancti Spiritus illustratione decoisti, da nobis in iodem Spiritu recta sapere, et eius semper consolatione cadere, per Christum Dominum nostrum,
Amen.
Sede sapientiae,
Ora pro nobis.
Nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, Amen. We're on the argument 2, number 52.7, about relations between church and state. In the first 3 centuries, the tremendous number of martyrs fought for the liberty and independence of the church. Likewise, at the same time, the doctors attribute to the pastors of the church power over spiritual things, but none to the prince. It is written that the church preached against the civil power, even with regard to the validity of matrimony. So we saw that. From that time on, the Roman pontiffs, the bishops, and other prominent men have very often suffered much for the liberty of the church, such as St. Athanasius and so forth. We saw those too. Hosius of Cordoba openly stated to Constantius the emperor. Constantius was the very persecuting emperor after Constantine. Constantius. All right, very pro-Arian, right? Anti-Orthodox. That was Arian versus Orthodox. That was the. Do not involve yourself in ecclesiastical matters. God has given you an empire, and He has confided it to us, ecclesiastical things. Confided to us, ecclesiastical things. Excuse me. And St. Athanasius, we read, how could you say that you are able to judge the bishops, for unless you obey them in what concerns God, you would be sentenced to death? Imagine saying that to the emperor. What pertains to God, give to God. What pertains to Caesar, give to Caesar. To the emperor do the palaces belong, but the churches belong to the priest. That's St. Ambrose. Symmachus, that should have. Symmachus, the Pope, to Anastasius. Because you are the emperor, do you think that you can despise the judgment? Do you think that because you are the emperor, you can strive against the power of Peter? All right. Nay, more, princes and all invested with power to rule have themselves approved it in theory alike and in practice. It cannot be called in question that in making of treaties, in the transaction of business matters, in the sending and receiving ambassadors, and in the interchange of other kinds of official dealings, they have been wont to teach with the church as with, treat with the church as with a supreme and legitimate power. That has always been the case, is that they would send ambassadors. The church was always considered a type of state, you might say. In the famous quote of Napoleon, you know what? One of his lieutenants, one of his generals, said, "How should I treat the Pope?" He said, "As if he has 200,000 soldiers armed for battle." So Napoleon said. See, the Pope has tremendous authority and tremendous influence. His nation, so to speak, is the whole world. Secondly, and Napoleon also said this, he controls from within. In other words, he gives orders that don't concern your body or external things, but concern interior things. In other words, and very, very deep things that concern morality. See, so Napoleon, I wish I could find that he was jealous of the Pope because all I can do is order soldiers around. He orders, souls around, or something like that. In other words, he recognized that the Pope has a much greater power because he has control over interior things in human beings, whereas rulers just control exterior things. Napoleon was no dope. As much as he was very brilliant as a student and all. He was no dope at all. But he won a lot of battles, but he lost the war. Doesn't matter how many battles you win, you have to win the war. That means he was a good tactician, but a bad strategist. See, strategy is how to win the war. Tactical is how to win the battle. But you have to win the war. Strategos in Greek means general. So that's where it comes from. Anyway, and he also said before he died, the priest has conquered, meaning Pius VII. He imprisoned him. They said he even beat him up. He did everything to make life miserable for him. He took him out of Rome and placed him in Savona, which is very northern Italy, and had him live there under guard for years. And then finally he took him to Paris and Fontainebleau, and he was very comfortable there. I saw where the Pope lived in Fontainebleau, but he tried to control the Pope, but it didn't work. So the priest is conquered, that's what he said. Nay, more princes and all invested with power to rule have themselves approved it in theory alike and in practice. It cannot be called in question that in the making of treaties, in the transaction of business matters, in the sending and receiving ambassadors, we said all that. Okay. So Constantine the Great said to the bishops, "You are the overseers in regard to those things which are within the church. I, however, am the overseer in those things which are done outside the church." It's Constantine, the famous Constantine. In Eusebius, the life of Constantine, that's the reference. Similarly, Theodosius the Younger said to the bishops of the Council of Ephesus, it is forbidden that he who is not listed in the catalogue of most holy bishops involve himself in ecclesiastical business and consultations. So Theodosius the Elder was the one that was forbidden to enter the Cathedral of Milan by St. Ambrose because he slaughtered a bunch of people in Greece. He is also the one that made the Catholic faith the state religion of the empire and outlawed both paganism and Judaism. He died in the 390s, I think. But you can see the power of the church that St. Ambrose would tell them, you can't come into this church until you do penance. The emperor. So we look at objections. Whatever is in the state is subordinated to the state, but the church is in the state. St. Optatus said the state is not in the church, but the church is in the state. So therefore the state is superior to the church. Response, I distinguish the major. Whatever is in the state formally is subordinated to the state. I concede. Materially, I deny. And with regard to the minor, the church is in the state formally, I deny. Materially, I subdistinguish. In a certain respect, I concede. Simpliciter, I deny. Optatus, however, does not disagree with us because he recalls this one thing, namely that the church, often attacked in other places, was safe within the Roman Empire, but not among the barbarian peoples. Therefore, he said the church is in the state, that is, in the Roman Empire, where there is the holy priesthood, purity, and virginity, which do not exist among the barbarian peoples, and if they did, could not be safe. To whoever reads these things, it is clear that Dupin, Baudouin, and other regalists very carelessly abuse this statement of Optatus. So that's not. Our distinction is seen to be entirely correct, for the church, since it is supreme in its own order by the order established by God, cannot be considered a part which the state formally contains as a whole pertains to its parts. So it's not a part of the state, it's not a department, you might say, of the state, the way you have the Department of Education or the Department of this or that or the other thing. It is not properly a function of the state, but it's in a state. In other words, it has a presence in a state. You see, so that means materially it is, but it's not part of the state's government. See, that would be formally. See, so that distinction comes up a lot. So to be materially in a state, however, that is by living in it, does not have the effect that the church is bound up with the civil power, which by divine law is exempt from the jurisdiction of the state. But not even by this is it true simpliciter that the church, because of the habitation of a greater or lesser number of its faithful in a certain state, is contained materially in it, for the church is circumscribed by no borders of a state, since it is a universal society and transcends all nations by its own end. It is said to be supranational, not international, but supranational. It's above nations. It's something that transcends, that means is above nations. And since citizens are subjected to political power in external things, but the church has members who are citizens, and in it can be seen many external things. Therefore, under this respect, the church is subjected to the state. Response, I distinguish the major. Men, as citizens, are subjected to the political power, I concede. As faithful, I deny. External things are subject to the state. If they are merely temporal, I concede. If they are spiritual, I deny. See, so that's, so yes, we're subjected to the laws of the state in everything that is temporal, but we are not subjected to the state in everything that is spiritual. And indeed, the same men and citizens are able to be faithful. As citizens, they are subject to the laws of the state. As faithful, they must obey the church. But St. Thomas very aptly says, man is not ordained to the body politic according to all that he is and has, and so it does not follow that every action of his acquires merit or demerit in relation to the body politic, but all that man is and can and has must be referred to God, and therefore every action of man, whether good or bad, acquires merit or demerit in the sight of God as far as the action itself is concerned. Let's want to see if any of these are worth doing. If you look at the quote of Leo XIII on the second column there, but where the power to command is wanting, or where a law is enacted contrary to reason or to the eternal law, such as abortion, or to some ordinance of God, obedience is unlawful, lest, while obeying man, we become disobedient to God. Thus, an effectual barrier being opposed to tyranny, the authority in the state will not have all its own way, but the interests and rights of all will be safeguarded, the rights of individuals, of domestic society, and of all the members of the Commonwealth, all being free to live according to law and right reason, and in this, as we have shown, true liberty really consists. So the state cannot bully the church effectively, and that the obedience to God is primary, and it is the church which points out what is the law of God. So I don't think these are. Yeah, these are not terribly important. A lot of it doesn't apply today because we're living in different times. This is written around 1900, so there were still monarchs, and there's still a lot of restriction of the church in Europe. I mean, like Catholic schools in France. They are very, very regulated. So even compulsory education, I don't know if you know that is a socialist principle. It's up to the parents to educate. It's completely up to the parents. It's in the interests of the state that people be educated, but the compulsory education was always considered something that was modern and socialist. Meaning schools, going to school, you see. Now, parents would be negligent if they didn't teach their children how to read, for example, or do basic things. But the idea of these public schools is something that is very modern, and it used to be, I mean, before, all the schools were controlled by the church in religious orders in Catholic countries such as France. But then with the Third Republic, they got rid of all of them and made public schools. And you know what they teach today in public schools is absolutely abominable. Teaching little kids to decide whether they're of the right sex or not. I mean, you know, people in first grade or second grade, you know, do you want to change? We never heard of that stuff. I mean, we didn't know it. If that had been done when I was growing up, there would have been such an outrage that you could have heard it all over the planet. Outrage that you would even bring that up to little kids. Now it's normal. And that the school does not have to inform the parent if the child, you know, if the girl wants to become a boy or the boy wants to become a girl. That's very common now. Not obliged to tell the parent.
think the child can actually get an operation done and the school won't tell the parent.
right? And that the teachers are required to use the proper pronouns. So if little Michael comes in as Michelle, then it's she. It's sick. No, it's and I think a lot of that has to do with Vatican II. The Catholic Church, if it were in its proper state, would just have screamed bloody murder over that stuff. But now it's so you can just see humanity failing and falling. I mean, again, in my own lifetime, there was at least observance of the natural law when I was growing up. In other words, things that are said now just would have been absolutely anathema, even by ordinary people, your next door neighbors. Just absolutely. But the world is sinking morally and intellectually into a sort of barbarism because there's just a lack of grace, and without a savior and without the effects of salvation, the human race sinks like a ship. That's what's happening. So. All right, Article 4. Whether the church ought to be separated from the state and the state from the church. This is very topical because of religious liberty, and the Vatican, after Vatican II, pursued both Italy and Spain to separate church and state. They had concordats, and the Vatican said these have to be changed so that the church doesn't have any particular recognition from the state. Status Questione says, much as the church preaches the distinction of each power, so it condemns their separation. But at the same time, while we reject separation and admit conjunction of the two powers, we do not admit their confusion. See, so they shouldn't be separated, but they shouldn't be confused. In other words, the church should not be a function of the state, and vice versa, the state should not be a function of the church. So each has its own object. Each in its kind, this is from Leo XIII, is supreme. Each has fixed limits within which it is contained, limits which are defined by the nature and special object of the province of each, so that there is, we may say, an orbit traced out within which the action of each is brought into play by its own native right. Therefore, preserving the distinction of societies, true order demands that church and state be connected not merely negatively, but positively by a mutual link. Therefore, the scope of this disputation is to prove what should be and what not, in fact, is in the various civil governments, or what could be obtained. So the object of the cooperative operation of the civil power and the ecclesiastical power. The common object and end of the operation of the civil government and of the ecclesiastical government is the perfection of man. So in temporal and spiritual, right? But the perfection of man is contained in two kinds of goods, one of which is temporal and the other eternal. But these goods must be bound together in an orderly way as a single total goal in the unity of man, because man is both body and soul. So therefore he needs a governmental help, you might say, in ordering his bodily needs, and governmental help, you might say, in ordering his spiritual needs. He's body and soul. So there's two different objects there. And because he's a one thing, church and state should not be completely separated any more than body is completely separated from the soul. That's the argument. But this ordered connection of goods is necessary both in individual men and in the multitude, since the same thing must be the judgment of the end of the whole multitude as of a single man. The end, however, of a human congregation or society, since it is also the end of ruling a society, is easily understood. The object and end of each power, while the action of neither is disturbed, is the one total good of the society, which is connected to in an ordered manner. These things having been said, it is clear that the good, which must be connected in an ordered manner in the citizens, requires the ordered connection of the two powers, of which God has given participation in the government of the human race. So, what I just said, effectively. Leo XIII said, "The Almighty, therefore, has given the charge of the human race to two powers, the ecclesiastical and the civil, the one being set over divine and the other over human things. Each in its kind is supreme. Each has fixed limits within which it is contained, limits which are defined by the nature and special object of the province of each, so that there is, we may say, an orbit traced out within which the action of each is brought into play by its own native right. But inasmuch as each of these two powers has authority over the same subjects, and as it might come to pass that one and the same thing, related differently, but still remaining one and the same thing, might belong to the jurisdiction and determination of both, therefore God, who foresees all things, and who is the author of these two powers, has marked out the course of each in the right correlation to the other. For the powers that are ordained of God," that's St. Paul. "There must accordingly exist between these two powers a certain orderly connection, which may be compared to the union of the soul and the body in man." So that's Leo XIII. Judgments of the Church against separation. Gregory the 16th said this concerning the separation of church and state. This is in Mirari Vos. This is against the liberals in France. Montalembert, Lamennais, Lacordaire, and other liberals. This 1830s. "Nor can we predict happier times for religion and government from the plans of those who desire vehemently to separate the church from the state and to break the mutual concord between temporal authority and the priesthood. It is certain that the concord, which was always favorable and beneficial to the sacred and civil order, is feared by the shameless lovers of liberty." I want to see the context of that because that reads kind of funny. Clear this. I'll look that up. It seems to be reading wrong. I think what he's doing here is quoting them. As according to them, these liberals, the best thing would be separation of church and state. But I'll check that. Pius IX in the syllabus lists this proposition. This is condemned. The church ought to be separated from the state and the state from the church. That's condemned. Leo XIII confirms the prescriptions of his predecessors in the encyclicals Immortale Dei and Libertas. In this last encyclical, he calls the false system of the reasons for separating church and state a pernicious idea. These things have no occasion for a subterfuge. Okay. So the thesis, the church must not be separated from the state, nor the state from the church. Argument 1. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder. But God willed that the civil and ecclesiastical powers be joined. Indeed, each power, inasmuch as it has come from God, is ordered. If one disassociates the reasons for the church and state, disorder arises. For their subjects are the same, and not infrequently they deal with the same objects, though in different ways. Whenever this occurs, since the state of conflict is absurd and manifestly repugnant to the most wise ordinance of God, there must necessarily exist some order or mode of procedure to remove the occasions of difference and contention and to secure harmony in all things. Again, libertas. After this, that God forbids that the state be separated from the church. The state as the state, because even the civil society is from God, must worship and revere God. See, that is an obligation of the state, and was, as I said, always observed by all civilizations, that there must be a public worship given to the state god or gods. See, it's only in modern times that has been considered not necessary. But even the United States has somebody in the opening of Congress say a prayer. Invite somebody in to say a prayer. So there's some recognition of that idea, but the state has an obligation to recognize the true God and the true religion, and to as the state to worship God. So the state should favor everything that all the feast days and the public processions, whatnot. The state or the civil power is constituted in such a way that it not only favors the temporal good of the citizens, but that it helps the citizens attain their eternal salvation. But this happiness is begun on earth, and it is to be consummated in heaven through the true religion, which the Catholic Church contains. Therefore, it is necessary that church and state be joined together. We learn the same thing from St. Thomas, who says in the De Regimine Principum, it pertains to each thing to accomplish whatever is ordered to something else as to an end. And he must pay attention that his work be in accordance with the end. See, so the end is what we call the queen of causes. It orders everything else toward itself. In this way, the swordsmith makes a sword in such a way, this is still St. Thomas, that it is suitable for fighting, and the builder must build the house in such a way that it is apt to be lived in. Because, therefore, the end of the life by which we live well in the present is celestial beatitude, it pertains to the duty of the king, for this reason, to procure the good life of the multitude, according as it is congruous with the attainment of celestial beatitude. And that was always done in Middle Ages, and that was commonly observed. I mean, if you denied that, you would be considered crazy. Argument 2, whatever things are ordered to procure one total good must coordinate their action into one, but the civil and ecclesiastical powers are ordered to procuring one total good, which is the good life of man and his happiness. Therefore, church and state must work together. The conclusion is most apparent from the help which the state is able to give to the church, and the church is able to give to the state. So wherever there is a single goal, but many entities working toward it, there must be a coordination of that. Think of a restaurant where there's a chef in charge, and then there's all of his assistants. All right, they are ordered toward putting a single plate in front of somebody and making that person happy. And so, if you have somebody that's not doing the right thing, then he gets in trouble, and so the chef Sometimes they were pretty, from what I understand, pretty nasty. They would throw things on the floor, just everything that was done. Yeah, that had to be perfect, in other words, and just don't give me this garbage. No, those chefs in those fancy restaurants were very, very strict. Well, for the prices they're getting out there, they should be. If any, people expect absolute perfection when they're paying some ridiculous price for it. But that's a principle. In other words, that if there's a single goal, everything has to work toward that goal. But the single goal is the happiness of man, both his temporal happiness and his supernatural happiness. The help of the state. St. Thomas says that the help which the state can give to the church comprises a few things, which he teaches, since he teaches that it pertains to the duty of the ruler to procure the good life of this multitude by that reason according as it is congruous with the obtainment of celestial beatitude, namely that he command those things which lead to celestial beatitude, and that he forbid those things which are contrary to it, as much as possible. So he must impose the natural law and impose even ecclesiastical laws, observance of ecclesiastical laws or customs, you might say, as I said, processions or days on which you should not work, things like that. And since the church is composed of men and not of separated souls, it is possible that it can be helped a great deal by temporal things. Because of these things, Aquinas said, for the good life of man, two things are required. One principal thing, which is the operation according to virtue, for virtue is that by which we live well, meaning in accordance with law. But the other is secondary and quasi-instrumental, namely the sufficiency of corporeal goods, of which the use that is necessary for the act of virtue. So even material things pertain to our life of virtue. Think of an example of that. In other words, that you have something to eat, for example, or a place to live and whatnot. When you see virtue is very important. The virtue of the citizens is an extremely important thing. You see why, for example, these immigrants coming in and murdering people and all in certain neighborhoods that you don't want to go into because there's lack of virtue. In other words, you may not come out of the neighborhood. But if everyone's virtuous, then you, in many cases, many years ago, even today probably in certain cases, you would leave the doors open. You wouldn't even lock the doors because no one would come in and harm you in any way. The former owner of this building never locked his doors. He says, I trust people. I thought, I don't. But it's true. I mean, neighborhood is pretty calm. But that's very important for the peace of society is what you might call civil virtues, that people do not molest each other and steal and rob and kill and do nasty things. Otherwise, life is quite miserable. The help of the church. In the Catholic Church, there is found the true religion of Christ. The true religion of Christ is also able to protect even civil society. Therefore, the church should not be separated from the state. Proof of the minor. That thing is perfected which is joined to Christ, but we are joined to Christ through the true religion of Christ. It is therefore plain that the state is perfect by its being joined with the church, in which Christ never ceases to live as the head of his body. The supernatural order perfects the natural order, but the supernatural order has been constituted in the true religion of Christ, therefore. The Church of Christ has a most noble, firm, and efficacious moral doctrine, which is the foundation of social life, what I just said. It has the deepest moral doctrine of any religion. It goes down into the depths of the law. Its laws go down into the depths of your intellect and your will. You can't even think a bad thought without a sin. It is dictating to your very interior thoughts. See, it has a very, very strict and deep morality, you might say, more than any religion in the history of the world. Indissolubility of marriage. Right? And that's an absolute. It's if you have a tough marriage, that's tough. That's why you should be careful. And today, especially because women are infected with feminism. 85% of the divorces are initiated by women because their husbands are controlling. That means they want to be the head of the house. In most cases. That doesn't exonerate all husbands, but so I always tell the young man, make sure there's no feminism. You're going to have trouble with this feminism. So, but it's rare that they don't have some poisoning of feminism. But again, even there, the church says, wives, be subject to your husbands in all things as to the Lord. That's a quote from St. Paul. So, no birth control, no abortion. Those are absolutes. So it's very invasive in a good way into society because of the demands of its very strict morality. In a Catholic society, you'd never see pornography, you would never see a dirty movie. Wouldn't exist. Be condemned. So it has a most noble, firm, and efficacious moral doctrine, which is the foundation of social life. It is most noble since it teaches perfectly all of the duties of men toward God, the government, and domestic society, one's neighbors, subjects, and oneself. So it upholds, it says to citizens, you must obey the government as you would God, that the government has the power of God to rule, and anything that is just, obviously. It's not infallible, but any kind of just law binds in conscience. So it upholds society, it upholds the government. It condemns tyrannicide, condemns revolution. The idea of revolting against the monarch or the government is typically Masonic. They are very revolutionist. It is firm since it is founded in religion. If one should take religion away, society would only have a defective and very fluid morality, as we know. It is efficacious since it obliges in conscience. So you have to go to confession. Remember what Father Cicada said about the Anglicans: great music and no confession. See, nice religion. Confession is a settling your accounts with God. See, this is a type of court. So it is unpleasant. And so when you do something seriously wrong, you have to go to confession. See? So there is a conscience, an urging conscience there. You can't just forget about it. One should add that the Church preserves three principles which are maximally social: the promotion of ordered progress, the antiquity of traditions, and authority. See, Kaiser Wilhelm II, although he was Lutheran, had a great respect for the Catholic Church because of it upheld authority. And even though he was a Lutheran emperor, the church recognizes authority. So he was very favorable to the Catholic Church. He exempted seminarians from military service. And in this country, they were exempt from military service too, until they did away with military service. But you would, you got a designation of 4D, which was divinity. This was back in the 60s. But unfortunately, that brought many unworthy people into seminaries. You're not going to get shot in the seminary during the Vietnam War, especially. That didn't help. So now before they did away with the draft, they did a lottery. So you got a number. I remember a number of them in the seminary, the modern seminary I was in. When they did the draft, they got low numbers and they left right away. The next day they were gone. Because the only reason they were there was to avoid the draft. But Kaiser Wilhelm did exempt seminarians from military service, which, for Germany was big. History confirms that great benefits were given to peoples by the church. Christian Europe has subdued barbarous nations and changed them from a savage into a civilized condition. This is Leo XIII. From superstition to true worship. That's true of Western Europe. I mean, those people were dreadfully barbaric. All those tribes running around Europe. Dreadfully barbaric. I told you about what the Germans did, right? It's pretty barbaric. The old Germans. Did I tell you that? Did I tell you that story? Maybe you didn't. If the man died, did I tell you that?
Yes, you did.
They'd kill the wife and the dogs. I always got a kick out of killing the dogs, as if the wife was one of the dogs. I mean, you could kind of see killing the dogs if the man isn't around, but they kill the wife and the dogs, and then burn them all up in a pyre. I mean, that's pretty bad. But the Vikings were very barbaric, and all those tribes were, and they were all civilized. It victoriously rolled back the Mohammedan conquest, Lepanto, and Vienna, retained the headship of civilization, stood forth in the front rank as the leader and teacher of all, and in every branch of national culture. So, I mean, all of the culture of Western Europe really, it comes from the church. Bestowed on the world the gift of true and many-sided liberty. So it was against any kind of oppression, not the liberty in the common Masonic context, but true liberty. There are certain legitimate liberties that human beings should have, and the church always defended those. And most wisely founded very numerous institutions for the solace of human suffering. So hospitals, poorhouses. The monasteries ran poorhouses. And they were nice. See, but when the state got a hold of them, they turned into things that were horrible. It's true in England. The monasteries in the Middle Ages in England did a wonderful job of running poorhouses. If you had no money, you'd go to the poorhouse. 3 meals a day. They probably had to work in the fields or something like that, but they had a place to live, and hospitals. And if we inquire how it was able to bring about so altered a condition of things, the answer is beyond all question, in large measure through religion, under whose auspices so many great undertakings were set on foot, through whose aid they were brought to completion. I pass over the prayers, the duties of heroic charity, and even monetary helps by which the church very often gave aid to the civil power. But even in our own time, full of ruin and with the portents of many ruins, especially, what's the word? One is a verb, one is portents. Of many ruins, especially in a moral crisis in which it languishes, confirm the divine sentence, miseros facit populos peccatum. Sin has made the people miserable. Very true. All the wars too. I mean, the horrible wars that are modern wars, as a result of sin and desertion from the church. Used to be the Pope would often regulate those things, and also there were very Christian rules about warfare. If you tagged your opponent in the Middle Ages, he had to give up. You could touch him and put down his arms. That's how Joan of Arc was caught. She was tagged. And you wouldn't attack on a Sunday or holy day of obligation, and you wouldn't attack while your enemy was eating. That was medieval times. So even warfare was regulated by a certain charity. And even as late as the 18th century, it was the common for the victorious to prepare a dinner for those who lost the battle, for the officers. Yep. That's what the French did for the English in upstate New York during the French and Indian War. It was Montcalm had a big table set for all the British officers. And that was civilization, you see. Now it's just... All right, take your break.
Your Excellency,
Yes.
here's the quote from Mirari Rose.
Yeah, it doesn't read right though. There's something wrong with it because he's saying those would be happier times. There has to be another context, and I just want to check the context.
This is the entire encyclical right here. It's about 10 pages in.
Yeah, let me look at this over here. Gregory the 16th. Only gives a part of it here. Who is that? I'll have to look up the whole. I just think it is something contextual that is wrong about it. It sounds like he's quoting them, and they're not. The context doesn't show that.
Right.
It's over there.
Yeah, I played No.
It's almost a 1-to-1. That's the thing. So when I went down, for break, my little brother was like, "Can we play some noise?" Okay, whatever. And then I laugh out.
You're terrible. Oh, goodness.
I'll have to look it up online.
It's not in the Denzinger Excellency. I looked for it too.
No, it isn't. No, I'll look it up online.
I don't know why it's not in the Denzinger.
It's not even in the traditional Denzinger.
Yeah.
That's a very important quote.
There is dogma in Mirari Vorse, isn't there?
Excuse me?
There's dogma in Mirari Vorse, isn't there? Is this?
I have to read it again to answer that question.
Sit down.
So from tradition, this is 53.13. The early church, despite pressure of persecution, gave precepts confirmed by examples which are contrary to the separation of powers. For apologists of the 2nd and 3rd centuries, namely St. Justin, Theophilus of Antioch, Tertullian, tried to persuade the rulers that the state would not be impeded by the Christian religion, but helped by it. At times, the church used the protection of the state when the occasion arose. In order to have assemblies of the faithful, the church defended itself with the laws of the altars, of the sepulchres, and the associations of people of lower rank. In a similar way, when Paul of Samosata fell from the true faith and at the same time from his episcopal see, but did not want to leave his house in the church of Antioch, the ecclesiastical authority asked Aurelian, the emperor, to expel the heretic from the church by means of the secular power, and he did. This was before Constantine. So that was in the 300s. Kick him out, please. And he did. St. Ambrose said, after the faith had been accepted by the emperors, a good emperor seeks help for the church and does not refuse it. I think that should be from the church, but let me check that. Yes. St. Gregory the Great said, power over all men has been given to the piety of our lords for this end, that they be helped who seek good things, and that the way to heaven be opened wider, that the terrestrial kingdom become the handmaid of the celestial kingdom. St. Isidore Pelluciota, the administration of things is composed of the priesthood and the kingdom. Although there is a great difference between them, the first is like the soul, the second like the body. They nevertheless both tend toward the same end, that is, the salvation of men. St. Nicholas teaches that the powers are distinct in such a way that Christian emperors need the pontiffs for eternal life, and the pontiffs use imperial laws only for the course of temporal things, to the extent that a spiritual action would be protected from carnal assaults. St. Ivo of Chartres wrote to Paschal II. That's in 1100s. Since the kingdom and the priesthood are suitable to each other, the world is well ruled and the church flowers and bears fruit. Constantine the Great wanted to be called an episcopos ad extra, that is, a defender of the faith. Charlemagne wanted to be called a devout defender of the church and its humble helper. In a similar way, the church was the church defended by St. Louis, the King of France, and by other rulers who truly worshipped God. See, so number of saintly, St. Ferdinand of Spain, Saint Germany, I can't remember his name. In Germany, and even ones that were not saints. It was just an accepted thing that church and state were united according to all of the rules, where they didn't interfere one with another, but they did work together. Objection 1, contraries expel each other mutually, but the church and state are like contraries. I distinguish the major contraries mutually expel each other from the same subject under the same aspect. I concede from a diverse subject or under a diverse aspect I deny. Well, that's pretty obvious. I don't think we need to really address these. look at 52.23 instance, both powers must be kept within their limits, but the system which does this is the one which is expressed by the formula of free church in a free state. Okay, and as I said, Bishop England proposed that, but that was an idea of the Enlightenment, the 18th century revolt against the church. And but again, here it was seen as, because the church had so much freedom here, it was seen as an ideal. See, and that's how it got into Vatican II, because Spellman, Cardinal Spellman, from Cardinal in New York, brought over John Courtney Murray, who wrote that document. He was an American. See, things in America are great, so let's make a doctrine out of it. So what happened. But you see, it was very important for ecumenism, because you can't tell somebody who is a non-Catholic, you don't have any right to practice your religion. That doesn't go over well in an ecumenical meeting. See, so everyone has a right to his own religion, whatever it is. That does well for ecumenism. Ecumenism is at the bottom of all of that stuff in Vatican II. Vatican II is all operated by ecumenism. One big happy church. The changes in the Mass, that was 6 Protestant ministers helped on that. It's all Protestant, and it's all fired by ecumenism. The collegiality that makes the Greeks happy. They have their synods. It's all ecumenism. Response, I distinguish the major. Both powers must be kept within their natural limits, that is, their true limits, I concede. Their naturalistic limits, I deny. Men are ordered to a higher end. St. Thomas says, it is incumbent upon each man to accomplish something which is ordered to something else as toward an end, and he must make sure that his work is in keeping with the end, which we saw. The system of a free church in a free state, which, in the sense of the adversaries, is not a liberty with concord, but a separation of powers, which is contrary to this order of things, since, per se, it recedes from it entirely in such a way that the divorce of the state from the church is approved, the separation of the state from God and Jesus Christ. Finally, it is the profanation of the entire civil society. So it makes civil society profane in the sense that it has no relationship, official relationship to God whatsoever. Objection 3, to have conflicts is evil, but the union of the powers, okay, that's not too important. Look at the quote from Leo the 13th in the second column there. There was once a time when states were governed by the philosophy of the gospel. Then it was that the power and divine virtue of Christian wisdom had diffused itself throughout the laws, institutions, and morals of the people, permeating all ranks and relations of civil society. Then, too, the religion instituted by Jesus Christ, established firmly in befitting dignity, flourished everywhere by the favor of princes and the legitimate protection of magistrates. And church and state were happily united in concord and friendly interchange of good offices. The state constituted in its wise bore fruits important beyond all expectations, whose remembrance is still and always will be in renown, witnessed to as they are by countless proofs which can never be blotted out or ever obscured by any craft of any enemies. Christian Europe has subdued barbarous nations and changed them from a savage to a civilized condition, from superstition to true worship. All right, so whether the church has an indirect power over temporal things, We are speaking here about indirect power, which is exercised not within the limits of the same power, but over a distinct power, independent in its own order, but which is connected to the first in some respect. And so the rule remains, each one is supreme in its own genus. And just as the state has no power over the sacraments or the institution of the bishops, so the spiritual power does not take care of the creation of army officers, or of selecting the best type of weapons, or of other merely temporal matters. Right? So it concerns a true power which must be obeyed. To assign to the church a mere higher grade of honor or of excellence is not sufficient, nor are we speaking about the temporal power which the Roman pontiff exercised over his own lands, or in certain regions which subjected themselves to him by their own accord, or by the positive laws of nations. But we will treat about their power over temporal things, which pertains to the successors of Peter by divine right. For that power, in view of its proximate end, is spiritual. It directly and spiritually directs spiritual things. It directs temporal things only to the extent that the supernatural end requires it. Therefore, we ask whether by divine right a power over temporal things pertains to the church, besides the fullness of power over spiritual things. This would be an indirect power, that is, as it is ordered to spiritual things, rather than a directive power, but lesser, greater than a directive power, but lesser than a direct power. So it's a sort of power, right? The question must be solved by the ultimate end of man. The order of societies is known from the ultimate end. Therefore, the ultimate end of man must be more intensely considered in order to more easily arrive at conclusions. But the ultimate end of both individuals and of the whole multitude is outside of the limits of civil society. For it is necessary that men tend in such a way that by living a virtuous life, they arrive at the enjoyment of God. That's the beatific vision. For this reason, St. Thomas says in the De Regimine, it is a certain good extraneous to man while he is living in mortal life, namely ultimate beatitude, which is expected in the enjoyment of God after death, because as St. Paul says, while we are in the body, we are absent from the Lord. And for the Christian man, that beatitude is acquired by the blood of Christ, and the Christian has received the pledge of the Holy Ghost in order to obtain it. Man does not attain this end through human power, but by divine power, according to the verse in St. Paul, the grace of God, life eternal. Therefore, to arrive at this end does not pertain to human government, but to divine government, the administration of the spiritual kingdom. Therefore, in order that spiritual things be distinct from terrestrial things, has been committed not to terrestrial kings, but to priests, and principally to the Roman pontiff, to whom all the kings of the Christian people must be subject, as if to the Lord Jesus Christ. So to him to whom the care of the ultimate end pertains, they must be subject who have the care of the inferior ends, and to be directed by his power. Right? Adversaries, they should be directly refuted who admit no power of the church over temporal matters, namely the authors and promoters of the Declaration of the Gallican Church, in which it claims that by divine right princes are subject to no ecclesiastical power in temporal matters. For a greater reason, the thesis attacks those who withdraw from the jurisdiction of the church, kings and other Christian princes in the very spiritual and ecclesiastical affairs. Indirectly, the thesis refutes the systems of direct power and of merely directive power. All right, so the arguments are going to be the same. In other words, the church has a certain sphere of power. It touches occasionally on temporal things, inasmuch as they are ordered to spiritual things. So, but it's going to stay away from, as it says, what weapons you should have and things that are purely of the temporal order. So that's going to be the gist of all of these arguments. You look at 54.13, Innocent III, when Count William of Monte Castellano asked that the pontiff deign to legitimize his sons in the year 1202 in the decree per venerabilem, Innocent III responded that the matter, since it is temporal, must be referred to the King of France. You ought to know how to be subject to others, for which reason, without a possible injury to them, unless they were to give their consent, you would not be able in this matter to subject yourself to us. You see, making somebody legitimate might mean that he could rule one day. So it's the King of France, not my domain. Likewise, the pontiff in the Decretal Novit, in order to settle controversies between France and England in the year 1204, indicates the power of the Church over temporal things in this way: for we do not intend to judge concerning the tract of land, but to judge concerning sin, the condemnation of which, without doubt, pertains to us, which we can and we must exercise against anyone. So, in a controversy over land, it's not going to be a civil judgment. It's going to be if there was any sin, if there was stealing involved or something like that. So, therefore, he does not construct a direct power of the Church over temporal things, but nevertheless claims an indirect power of the Church. Boniface VIII in the bull Unam Sanctam signifies the same thing, affirming that the spiritual power can judge the temporal power if it has not been good. See, so if a king was misbehaving somehow, the Pope would say something, and that was a very positive thing. It was sort of like a referee in a game, blow the whistle. You see, if not in a purely temporal manner, but if he were doing something like an unjust war, for example, he might say something. Similarly, if the terrestrial power should deviate, it will be judged by the spiritual power. Hence, the explanation of the bull given by Boniface VIII himself when he wrote to King Philip, "For 40 years we have been expert in the law, and we know that there are two powers ordained by God. Who therefore must or can believe that such stupidity and dullness would be or has been in our head? We say that in nothing do we wish to usurp the jurisdiction of the king. The king cannot deny, nor any of the faithful, that he is subject to us by reason of sin." So that's Philip IV. He was he's the grandson of St. Louis. And he gave the Pope a lot of trouble. That's the beginning of the 1300s. It's really sort of the beginning of the Renaissance, you might say. It's when his lieutenant went and slapped Boniface VIII in the face. See, yeah. Yeah.
Was he the king who helped disband the Templars?
Yes. And it's very controverted, the reasons for it. Some say they were dabbling in a type of Eastern witchcraft. Others say they had a lot of money. It is certain that they had a lot of money. So were the controversy is, were the crimes trumped up in order that the king grab all of their property and funds, the Knights Templar? And nobody really knows the answer to that. I don't think it's ever been really answered, but that was the suspicion, because he was not what you call, he wasn't any St. Louis, let's put it that way. There was a controversy. What started up was a controversy of taxing the church for his wars. And actually, the church was willing to contribute to his wars, but there was, I forget exactly, I think the question was how it was done. And so that's when there was a controversy between him and Boniface VIII. And he also called a council in which he said that the bishops of France don't have to respond to the Pope. Essentially what Henry VIII did. It didn't last long, but there was actually a schism in France, declaring themselves separate from the Pope. And all the French bishops caved in, as they always do. They very typically love France more than the church. Sorry to say, but that's their history. Not all, but very many. They all caved into Gallicanism. Virtually all of them. Yes.
So, Your Excellency, when the church gives a monarch or a government money for wars and other such necessities, does the church get paid back, or how does it work?
Not necessarily. In other words, it's in the interest of the church, for example, that the kingdom be protected. See, so it's a form of tax. And they were not opposing that, you see, but there was, and I just can't remember exactly what the problem was, but there was a problem between Philip the Fair and the monasteries and so forth. And so that's when Barnabas VIII intervened and said, it's necessary for salvation that you be subject to the Roman Pontiff. St. Thomas expresses in these words his position concerning the indirect power. The secular power is under the spiritual power to the extent that it is subjected to it by God, namely in those things which pertain to the salvation of the soul. Right, and so forth. It's really all the same principle. I don't think we need to insist on that anymore. It's the same principle. And to a certain extent, it's, well, even to a great extent, it's theoretical now because everywhere the church is separated from the state, in almost all cases. All right, now we pass to councils, which is more topical, I might say. So what is a council? What ends of councils there are? What kinds of councils there are? By whose authority an ecumenical council may be celebrated? Whether an ecumenical council is infallible? Whether an ecumenical council is above the Pope? Whether an ecumenical council is necessary? The concept of a general council from the Greek synodos, hodos in Greek means path or way. So syn means together, so coming together, or that's the idea. As it has been called by others, a congregatio, that's the same idea. Convento, same idea. A synodale concilium, conventus synodalis. So it is a coming together of bishops under legitimate authority for the purpose of judging and legislating concerning ecclesiastical affairs. I said of bishops, that is, of judges per se, but a diocesan synod or a meeting of one bishop and his clergy is not contained in the definition, since for many centuries the word council has been restricted to merely a meeting of bishops. It is added concerning ecclesiastical affairs, that is, concerning matters of faith, morals, or discipline. There are two kinds of councils, general, which we will discuss principally, and two particular, which are subdivided into national, provincial, and diocesan. The first council concerning matters of faith was held in Jerusalem. So the Acts of the Apostles. Councils around the middle of the 2nd century were held in Asia Minor, as Eusebius relates. In HE, that means Historia Ecclesiastica. Church history is loaded with examples of many councils celebrated over the centuries. So there's many local councils, provincial councils, a lot. In the library, you have the Mansi collection. That's all those, not only the big councils, but the little councils, the local councils. So, for example, there were 2 councils of Baltimore, maybe 3. Baltimore American bishops came together in Baltimore and had councils, and it's actually it's in the Pontifical how to celebrate a provincial council, etc. There's actually certain rules for its celebration. It's not just sitting around a table and, what do you think, Bob? You know, it's very formal. The ecumenical council. The general council or ecumenical council, which comes from the word oikumene, which means the inhabited world. So it means a call is made to all the bishops of the world in principle. And that means sitting bishops, diocesan bishops with jurisdiction. auxiliary bishops do not have a right to be called, but may be invited, and don't necessarily have a right to vote, but they may be given the right to vote. See, so auxiliary bishops were people to do confirmations. That's their purpose in life in a big diocese, and a lot of confirmations. I mean, maybe they could have easily 200 or 300 churches in some of these huge dioceses, and yes.
Would a diocesan bishop then be responsible for ordination of priests?
Usually he did ordinations, but not necessarily. He could ask an auxiliary to do them. But usually the diocesan bishop would do the ordinations. But typically the diocesan bishop did not do the confirmations. In its heyday, New York Archdiocese had 16 auxiliary bishops. Yeah. I know, it's a lot. Think of that ceremony. I always pitied the MCs in that, because for those big ceremonies where you could have had cardinals, you could have had bishops, and then Monsignori. Monsignori look exactly the same as bishops, except no pectoral cross and no zucchetto. But they look exactly the same. They wear the mantelletto. So, like in getting a procession together, where everybody's very conscious of his dignity and who goes before whom, a huge procession together with all of those bishops, all of those Monsignori, protonotaries, apostolic, all of these dignitaries, wasn't easy. You could really offend somebody. I think that's one of the reasons why they had the zucchetto, because then you could see right away who was who. You could tell a bishop from the cardinal right away, because the cardinal wears a very, very scarlet red, whereas the bishop wears this purple, you see, and so you could tell. And then you had heads of religious orders in their garb. It must have been just a nightmare for MCs. So ecumenical doesn't mean ecumenism, it just means worldwide. For the purpose of judging under the authority of the Roman Pontiff, I said from the whole world, for in this way an ecumenical council is distinguished from a national council to which are convoked the bishops of a certain patriarchate, kingdom, or nation, where the patriarch or primate presides, and from the provincial council to which bishops of one ecclesiastical province are convoked, where the metropolitan presides. See, a province has an archdiocese over it. See, so typically in this country there was one archdiocese per state, and the rest would be suffragan dioceses to the archdiocese, and therefore the bishop of the archdiocese was the archbishop. And he had, according to canon law, certain authority in the suffragan dioceses, and they would have, therefore, that was the province, and they would have, and this country it was by state, you see, so each state would be a province, would have a number of dioceses in it, and the dioceses in this country are much bigger than the ones in Europe. The ones in Europe were founded when there were horses and buggies, or even just horses, in the early church. So you couldn't have a very widespread diocese where you get in your car and you drive over. So the dioceses in Italy have always been very small. Where the bishop, which is really not a bad thing, because then the bishop would have much more control over priests and lay people. He would be seen more, whereas in otherwise he becomes sort of a chancery figure that you hardly ever see. It's That's the way it is, anyway. But by the term convoked, we mean that it is right that all be called, but it is not necessary that all come together, provided that the princes of the church are congregated in such a number that those congregated are considered to represent the Catholic Church. So there has to be a sufficient number. So if you make a big call for all the bishops to come together and 3 show up, it doesn't do the job. There has to be and I don't know what the number is, but I'm sure that's up to the Pope. So the call goes out. Not everyone can come. Sometimes there's causes of health, in times of war or something. You don't want to take any chances. Could be anything at all, which would impede some people from coming to the council. That was more true now than it is, more true in the past than it is now. You get on an airplane and go. Finally, we say under the authority of the Roman Pontiff, this authority is exercised by convoking, presiding, and confirming. See, so the council has no value whatsoever until the Roman Pontiff promulgates its decisions. So, it's worth 0 until he promulgates it. These things having been said, ecumenical councils are divided into those which are convoked by the Roman Pontiff and those not convoked by him. They are also divided into those confirmed by the Roman Pontiff and those which are not confirmed. See, he has the authority. The term ecumenical is more strictly taken to pertain to confirmed councils. So, for example, the Second Council of Ephesus was condemned by St. Leo the Great in the middle of the 5th century as the Robber Council. It was full of heresy. He just condemned it. Just forget about it. Something has to be done to Vatican II. The Second Council of Robbers, or something like that. And also, it can go the other way. A local council could have its decisions elevated to a general teaching by the Pope, and he can even give it the designation of an ecumenical council. He can do that too. So he has all the power. They are ecumenical by action if those things which are expressed in the definition are fulfilled from the convocation all the way to the confirmation. They are ecumenical by acceptance if something should be lacking, but where the explicit or tacit consent of the bishops and of the Roman Pontiff, recognizing a valid council, should supply for whatever is lacking. So as I said, he can elevate something that's local to general, or at least having the effect of a general council. Who should be congregated into an ecumenical council? The bishops per se ought to be called in order that they might make a decisive act as judges in the true sense of the term and as proper constitutive members of a council. For such is the divine constitution of the Church that the principal roles in its government belong to those who are called bishops, that is, in the particular dioceses. This is evident from those things which we said above concerning the hierarchical constitution of the Church and concerning the subject of infallibility, and B, from the practice of the Church. So they have a voice in the general government of the Church when the Pope asks them to. All right. Even cardinals who are not bishops are to be summoned and have a decisive vote. but it is controverted whether this right to vote is by an ordinary right or by privilege and custom. See, for diocesan bishops, it's by ordinary right. That means it pertains to their office. For others, for example, auxiliary bishops, that would be by custom or privilege. And it's disputed with regard to cardinals. Since the whole business of the council, as Canis, Melchior Canis says, concerns the power of jurisdiction and not the power of orders, they also should be summoned to the council and by right have a decisive vote who are bishops not yet consecrated but have episcopal jurisdiction. See, so you could be named a bishop, and for as long as you consent to be consecrated, you already have the power. Yes. So, Father so-and-so is the bishop. He becomes Your Excellency even before he's consecrated. And the consecration might take a long time. It might take a month or two. You never know. I mean, again, horses and buggies, Or inclement weather. If you're named in the middle of winter and you're in the Alps, or it might be a long time before you see your consecration. But he has so it is a question of jurisdiction, not of consecration, and that's important for Vatican II because they said by consecration you obtain jurisdiction. See, and so that's for collegiality. So you have this right to rule the church from your consecration, and that's why they changed the formula of consecration of bishops to emphasize their authority, which makes it invalid because the authority is not granted by consecration. And so the sense of it is all twisted. So that's an important point. So that you could actually have jurisdiction before consecration. Furthermore, the superior generals of orders and exempt abbots blessed by a bishop, although the right of a decisive vote does not pertain to priests and deacons, nevertheless enjoy this right. So the Pope can give the decisive power, that means a decisive vote, to whomever he pleases, really. Within reason. I mean, he can't give it to the local construction worker or something like that, but it's somebody that to whom it is, might pertain by some sort of honor. Bishops who are titular or who are named in partibus, that means in dioceses, that's titular bishops, it's the same thing, a diocese that doesn't exist anymore but existed at one time. Typically dioceses in the Middle East or Turkey that were taken over either by Muslims or by schismatics. And when you were named a titular bishop, that means a bishop without jurisdiction, you would be given a title of a diocese that once existed but has fallen into desuetude. And so, for example, Archbishop Lefebvre was the titular bishop of Sanada in Phrygia. Phrygia is Asia Minor. And it fell to the Muslims. And that was to show that a bishop has an order to jurisdiction. In other words, that even though you are consecrated without authority in a diocese, nonetheless, that there is an order to jurisdiction with regard to the episcopacy. The very term episcopos means an overseer. See, so there is a certain order to it. And that's why the idea is that you could not fulfill your function as a diocesan bishop completely and totally unless you were consecrated. In other words, you had to have the fullness of the priesthood in order to govern properly. So the consecration was done so that you could be not only the boss with regard to jurisdiction, but also that you had control over ordinations and confirmations. So there is a relation and an order to jurisdiction, because for that reason. In other words, that they naturally go together, you might say, but they are distinct. Let's see, and if you can separate something, and they are separated, it means that they are really distinct. So separation is always a sign of real distinction, not merely a distinction of reason. If you can separate two things, it's a sign of real distinction, and not a distinction of reason. Now, some things you can't separate but are really distinct, but nonetheless, separation is a sign. That's just a general philosophical principle, is a sign of that, of two really distinct things. Another sign of two really distinct things is two really distinct objects. A faculty is determined by its object. If its objects are really distinct, then you have two separate faculties that are really distinct. You'll see how that plays out. You'll see how philosophy, knowing your philosophy is very, very important for knowing your theology and doing theology. Thinking theologically, extremely important. So know your philosophy well. All right. Most theological errors are based on philosophical errors. Most. So bishops or titular, okay. They lack jurisdiction, and de jure are not to be called to the council. Others give to them a right of a decisive vote because of a jurisdiction in actu primo, which they have with respect to the churches of their titles. Actu primo means fundamentally. Actu primo is to have the ability to act, but without acting. That's actus secundus. So a faculty is actus primus. When it acts, it's in actus secundus. Does that register with, yes?
Is it like an act in potency?
Well, it's a perfection which is ordered to an act, a second act, but act is perfection. In other words, a perfection is something that is better to have than not to have. To have it instead of lacking it. So that's a perfection, and that's considered act. You see, it doesn't mean act in the sense of you're moving your hands. It just means act that it is something that is distinguished from potency. See? So your intellect has actus primus. In other words, it is capable of understanding abstract things. When you study, you're reducing your intellect to actus secundus, hopefully, because it is taking in information. Your arm is actus primus. When you hit a ball or something, it's in actus secundus. See, so the idea was they have the faculty of governing in actu primo. Whereas if the diocese was still functioning, they could be the bishop of it. That's the idea. It's you could argue about it. Let's put it that way. I mean, when your diocese is a bunch of Muslims, I think it's pretty far-fetched, but whatever. Others finally think that jurisdiction is attached to consecration in such a way that jurisdiction pertains to bishops not singularly, but as they are gathered together and acting as a council. See, so, but I know those are not big theologians, but the idea of collegiality is even outside of a council, they govern the church. As they have this jurisdiction over the whole church, even outside of council. Many others, although they do not give these any right of a decisive vote, nevertheless say that they can be called, namely the following men who are outstanding in prudence and wisdom, who discuss the matters to be treated and can help the fathers by counsel. So, for example, the bishops would typically bring their periti. That's how you pronounce that. A peritus. That means an expert. So they had their periti, who would be theologians typically and would advise them. Because bishops are generally not theologians in general. They are meant to govern, they're pastoral. You see, that's their bishops of dioceses. In per-accidens, they might be great theologians, you see, but normally they're not. In this country, they were called brick and mortar bishops. Raise the money, build the schools, build the churches. And I was told by a priest years ago that they never made theologian bishops in this country because they were afraid that they would go into schism or heresy and take all the property with them. Because the way in which the property in this country is organized is that the bishop of the diocese with one signature could take it all. Everything. So they wanted them dumb and just managers. Canon law, they all had to get degrees in canon law. See, that's just, what's the rule book, you see? So, and they were called brick and mortar bishops because they would, it's, you see, when the church was expanding exponentially in the 19th century, early 20th century, churches were going up everywhere. Schools, seminaries, convents, everywhere. So the bishop had to get involved in all of those things. All right. How many bishops are required in order to make a council ecumenical? In Canos Melchiorcanos, we read this: it is not sufficient for a general council if the convocation is general, when so few are congregated that the greater and better part of the provinces seem to have been left behind. This is especially true if the cause is legitimate why the bishops are not at the synod, like war. But if through the malice of evil men one or another province should be absent, the title of general council is not lost for this reason. So sometimes emperors would say, we forbid you to go to the council. But if through negligence or any other occasion some bishops are absent, the council would not lose its title of general, unless we would want to call into question whether the four councils of Nicaea, Ephesus, Constantinople, and Chalcedon were general councils. So he's saying that you're going to have some trouble if you apply that principle. Those things are evident, namely that a council must have a congregation of bishops as is necessary for the representation of the whole Christian name. It is necessary that the greater part of bishops come to the council. It is not necessary provided that there is a sufficient number of bishops and from so many places that they are considered to represent the church dispersed throughout the world. That's really up to the Roman pontiff to decide. Again, he has all the power. All right, I think we'll quit there. All right. Let's do it. Today is Bishop Selway's birthday. 48, I think. I told him this morning, happy birthday, on a text. About 2/3 of your life is already shot. So he said that was the nicest birthday greeting that he got today. So I wonder what the others were like. 26. So yeah, he was born in 1978. That means he's 48 today. He's in good shape for 48. But yeah, it's about 2/3 gone. So did you know it was his birthday? No. Aren't you his nephew? I'm sure he doesn't expect it. He probably doesn't know your birthday either, right? Or does he? Does he ever say anything to you about your birthday? Or is that just sort of forgotten about? Too many birthdays in your family. Every day would be a birthday in your extended family. There's like millions of them down there. It's like like a mountaintop in West Virginia, you know, that everybody's in the same family. So, all right, let's quit there. Let me put a marker in here. Well, you should send him an email or something. Tell your cousin too. He probably doesn't know any more than you do, right? It's only a bishop, yeah. All right. Nomine Patris et Filii Spiritus Sancti, Amen. Sub tuum praesidium confugimus sancta Dei genitrix nostros deprecationes et specias in necessitatibus, sed a periculis cunctis libera nos semper virgo gloriosa benedicta. Nomine Patris et Filii Spiritus Sancti, Amen.